Today we're going to learn about how to shift the sine and cosine curves. And we're going to be dealing with two types of equations. One equals y equals the sine of x. And we're going to be adding a value to it. That value could be positive or negative. We'll call it d. Or y equals cosine of x. And once again, we'll add a value to it. And that could also be positive or negative. And we'll call it d. So let's look at a problem. Notice here we have y equals the sine of x plus d. D in this case is 0. And so you see the graph of y equals the sine of x on the right-hand side. If we were to increase the value of d by moving this little slider, notice as I move the slider over, d becomes 1. Watch what happens to the graph. 2, d is 3. So now it's y equals the sine of x plus 4, sine of x plus 5, sine of x plus 6, and so on. I can go in the opposite direction. So let's go to negative 1. Let's go to negative 2, negative 3, negative 4. I think the pattern becomes pretty clear that as we increase the value of d to 1, the graph has moved up 1 unit. If we increase the value of d to 2, it has moved up 2 units, and so on and so forth. So it's pretty easy to see that the graph maintains its same shape, and all that is happening to it is it's simply being shifted up and down. So if d is negative, it goes down. If d is negative 2, it goes down 2 units. Negative 4 goes down 4 units, and so on and so forth. Now the same thing is true for the cosine curve. So here we have the cosine curve. Notice as we add 1 to the cosine, it will move up 1 unit. If we make d equal to 2, it moves up 2 units, 3 units. And of course, if we were to go in the negative direction, starting here at d equals 0, now negative 1, it moved down 1 unit, moves down 2 units, moves down 3 units, and moves down 4 units. So the value of d certainly controls the vertical shifting of the sine and cosine curves. So to summarize what we have so far, if we have y equals the sine of x plus d, or cosine of x plus d, and d is positive, the graph is shifted up. If d is negative in y equals the sine of x plus d, or y equals the cosine of x plus d, then the graph is shifted down. So let's do a problem. What we want to do is try to find the equation of this graph. And the first thing that you should do in order to find the equation is find the midline. And if we can find the midline, then we can find out if this graph has been shifted up or down. We can find a number of other elements as well. And you might remember the equation to find the midline, we simply find the average of the max and min point. If you notice in this case, the maximum point is at 6, and the minimum point is at 4. So the max is 6, the minimum point is 4. To find the midline, we simply say 6 plus 4 over 2, which is 10 over 2, or 5, which means the equation of the midline is equal to y equals 5. So let's just draw that in. Now we can start seeing the graph a little more clearly, because we know that in the sine curve starts at the midline at 0. And you'll notice right here when x is 0, or the angle is 0, the graph also starts on the midline. So that would tell us this is a sine curve. It starts there, and of course it goes up and then down and so on and so forth. But the equation of the midline tells us how much this graph has been shifted. In this case, normally the equation of the midline is y equals 0. The sine curve would be down here if we were to draw it. And it would come up like this and go down to here and come up. And notice that the midline is y equals 0. But now it's y equals 5. Well, that tells us that the graph has been shifted up 5 units. So since the midline equals 5, since the midline is at y equals 5, the graph is shifted up 5 units. Well, if it's shifted up 5 units, then we can figure out the equation of the graph. We know that the equation is a sine curve, so let's put it in here. We know it's going to be in the form of y equals the sine of x plus d. And in this case, we know it's moved up, so d must be positive. And since the midline is at 5, it must be 5. So we know that d is equal to 5. So we finally get y equals the sine of x plus 5. And this is our equation. Let's move it over there. And there you go. And that's how we figure out the equation of this graph. Why don't we try one more? So here's another graph. We want to find the midline. And so once again, we find the maximum point, which is here at -3. We find the minimum point is at -5. To find the midline, we simply find the average of -3 plus -5/2, which is -8/2, which is -4. And therefore, the equation of the midline is y equals -4. And that's our equation of the midline. Well, that also tells us that our value of d must be equal to -4, since the equation of the midline is -4. So now we have d. D is equal to -4. Now we have to figure out, is this a sine or cosine? And that's actually pretty easy, because if we remember, if we draw in our little midline, it'll become a lot clearer. So let's draw in our little midline at -4. And we know the sine curve always starts right on the midline at x equals 0. But you notice in this case, it's starting 1 above the midline. Well, that's what the cosine curves look like. And just to remind you, we can draw a cosine curve. -1 comes up back to the midline and then goes up. Notice that the red curve down below does the same thing. It starts at 1 above the midline and then continues down to the midline 90 degrees later, or pi over 2 radians. And finally, at a minimum point, 90 degrees later, and then another 90 degrees, or pi over 2 radians, back to the midline and up. So we can see that this graph is actually the cosine curve. So now that we know it's a cosine curve, and we know what d is, we can get its equation. We know it's in the form of y equals the cosine of x. And since d is -4, we just simply write -4. And that is the equation of this curve. So once again, just to summarize, in order to find the equation of the curve, if it has been shifted, we simply can find that out by finding the equation of the midline, and that will give us the value of d. And then we have to decide if it's a sine or cosine curve. Remember, in this case, since the graph at x equals 0 starts 1 above the midline, that means it is a cosine curve. If you remember in the previous one, it was at it starts at the midline, and I could show you that. And this one, as you remember, this one started at the midline, so we knew this to be a sine curve. So 2 steps: first find the midline, then decide if it's a sine or cosine curve. So to summarize, to find the equation of a graph that's been shifted vertically, remember that the equation will be in the form of y equals the sine of x plus d, or y equals the cosine of x plus d, where d can be positive or negative. Then next, find the equation of the midline, which will give you the value of d. And then you need to determine if it is a sine or cosine curve. Once you've done that, you're able to find its equation. Okay, now it's your turn. We'd like you to find the equation of each graph. So pause this screencast and take a look at it and see if you can find the equation. Good luck, and I'll see you again next time.